I'm continuing a sermon series today that I started 2 weeks ago on the importance of the church, why the church matters. You already know this. There has been much discussion over the last 10 or 15 years about the sins of the church, the weaknesses of the church, about the irrelevance of the church. And I just am at the point in my life where I thought it was time to mount a strong defense of the church. In spite of the fact that we've sometimes have been irrelevant, I want to make the case that of all of our institutions, and the church is an institution that's guided by human hands. Of all our institutions, the church is the most indispensable one to you and to me, to a civil society, for a number of reasons, and hopefully we'll cover them all by the time we get through next week. But today we're going to talk about the importance of the church to our neighbors, the importance of the proclamation. Let me invite you to turn with me to the 22nd verse of the 8th chapter of Mark's Gospel. When it says they came, we're talking about Jesus and the disciples. They came to Bethsaida. Some people brought a blind man to Jesus and begged him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. He did not want this to be a public healing for whatever reason. And when he had put saliva on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Can you see anything?" And the man looked up and said, "I can see people, but they look like trees." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he looked intently, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Back in the 1950s, when I was but a child, my father was the associate pastor at First United Methodist Church in downtown Dallas, Ross and Harwood. He worked for the legendary preacher Robert E. Goodrich Jr. Back in those days, they had Sunday evening services as well as Sunday morning services. Occasionally, my father would get to preach on Sunday mornings, but he often preached on Sunday evenings. He once preached a sermon in a Sunday evening service entitled, "Failure is Not Final." He was extraordinarily disappointed in it. By his own admission, it was one of the worst sermons he had ever preached. After the sermon, he went up to his office, he took the sermon, he shredded it, he filed it in the trash can, never to be preached again. About 20 years later, he was the guest preacher at the Bloys Camp Meeting in Far West Texas. Some of you have heard me talk about the Bloys Camp Meeting. It's out in the middle of nowhere between Marfa and Fort Davis, Texas, but a couple of thousand people going to church every day. One evening, he preached a sermon at the Bloys Camp Meeting, and after the service was over, people came by and greeted him, as was usually the case. A woman at the very end of the line came up to him when everybody else had left and said, "Dr. Underwood, you don't know me, but I know who you are." She said, "Have you got a moment for a story?" And he said, "Of course." She said, "Back in the early 50s, I was living in the North Texas area. I lived in a rural city not far from Dallas. And when I graduated from high school, I did what a lot of young people were doing in those days. I decided to go to the big city to make my fame and fortune. So I and a couple of friends moved to Dallas. My parents didn't want me to do this. They wanted me to stay home. But I was strong-willed and hard-headed. I moved to Dallas. I immediately found a part-time job, rented an apartment, but soon things started to go downhill. To make a long story short, after about 9 months, I no longer had a job. I no longer had any money. I had all sorts of bills. I was about to be evicted from my apartment. I went into a very, very deep depression. She said, one day I took what little money I had, I went to a pawn shop and I bought a gun with the intention of killing myself. I put it in my purse. One Sunday night, I was wandering the streets of downtown Dallas, trying to find the courage to take this gun out and end my life. And all of a sudden I looked up and I saw the big Gothic tower of First Methodist Church. And I was reminded of the church of my childhood. I went to a little Methodist church in the town I grew up in. And I wondered if there would be services that night. And so I walked the remaining blocks to the church. Sure enough, there were services. She said, "I walked in and you were preaching. And you preached a sermon entitled, 'Failure is Not Final.'" She said, after more than 20 years, I need to say thank you because that sermon saved my life. I threw the gun away. I persisted. I've had a good job and a good life for the last 20 years. Let me say to you that one of the worst things we can ever do is to underestimate the power of the proclamation of the church. The power of the proclamation of the church. Ordinarily, when we talk about neighbors around here in this church, we're talking about the mission programs that we have. House on the Corner left earlier this week. You may have noticed it's missing. It's sitting over in the Douglas community as of this morning. Project Hope, Project Next Generation. Dozens of programs that we have in the life of this church to serve our neighbors. But this morning I want to talk about our neighbors in a different way. And when I use the word neighbor today, I'm talking about those who are sitting here in this room today, those who are on the edge of the church, who occasionally pop in, and those who are outside the circle, but who are nevertheless in need of the powerful proclamation of the church. The proclamation that changes the way in which we see ourselves. It changes the way in which we look at others. It changes the way in which we look at life. The life-changing, life-saving proclamation of the church. And you might say legitimately so, what is the proclamation of the church? Well, there are a number of ways of getting at that, but I want to try to condense it with you. All of these are things that you've heard preached from this pulpit over the last number of years, but I'm going to try to get it down to 5 simple statements that comprise the proclamation of the church. First proclamation of the church involves creation. We are all the children of God, created by God, wondrously knitted together in the wombs of our mothers. If you were here 2 weeks ago and heard my sermon on the importance of children in the life of the church, you've heard this proclamation, I think, in a pretty powerful way. It's simply the good news. We aren't just here by accident. We are here by design. That God created you and me and created us with intrinsic value and worth. Grace. We are all sinners who fall short, but we are loved by God and saved by grace. It's at the very center of our understanding of life. You go back and you read Genesis, you don't have to read this literally. You can or you can read it more symbolically. It makes no difference. What it tells us about is a world that was created in perfection, but which is a fallen world. It is a fallen world. Because you and I live in a fallen world, we make mistakes. We are fallible human beings. Use the word sin if you want, or not if you want. Doesn't make any difference. We know that we are imperfect human beings. But the life-saving proclamation is that God loves us even when we make mistakes. And we are forgiven and empowered by God's grace, God's unmerited love. Redemption. No matter who you are, where you've been, what you've done, God's grace can reach you and transform your life. And because of that, God has a job for you. That there's meaning and purpose in your life, a job specifically for you where you can make a difference. The kingdom. The one who created the world in perfection, the Garden of Eden, will restore it to its perfection. Partially in this life and fully in the kingdom to come. We talk about that in the Christian church, of course, the kingdom to come. The fact that you read Revelation 21, there will be no more tears, no more crying. But we also believe as Christians that the kingdom exists partly in this life as we are in relationship with the life-giving life of Jesus Christ. So we are kingdom people. We live for the kingdom to come, but we also live in the kingdom of now. And then finally, I kind of made this up. This isn't traditional theology, but I like this. Joy. Because of all of these things, we can live with joy and hope and thanksgiving, even in the midst of the despair that we so often experience in life. God empowers us to live with thanksgiving and with joy. That is the proclamation, the good news of Jesus Christ that changes the way in which we see ourselves, the way in which we see others, the way in which we view life itself. So let's talk for a minute about what happens when we come into a relationship with Jesus Christ. We read this story a moment ago about Jesus healing this blind man. Let me give you an interesting exercise to do. You can do this whether you're a Bible expert or not. Go to your computer and get an online Bible. Any version, doesn't make any difference. And go to the New Testament and do a word search for the word blind. And what you'll find, starting there in Matthew and throughout the New Testament, are literally dozens and dozens and dozens of instances in which the word blind is used. In the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the word blind, when you read through there, you'll see this, is used in three different ways. One way it's used is when Jesus is, in a general way, Jesus healing the blind. It'll say Jesus went out and he healed the lame and the blind. Several references like that. There's another way in which it is used, and that is Jesus referred to his enemies as oftentimes as being blind. When he talks about the Pharisees, he says, "You are blind." In other words, you don't see things clearly. And then the third way in which the word blind is used is with these individual, particular instances in which Jesus heals someone that is blind. And there are a lot of healings like that in the New Testament. This one today, Jesus comes up to this man. He takes him out of town for whatever reason. He wants this to be a private healing rather than a public healing. And he touches him once with the saliva and he says, "How are you doing?" And the man says, I can see better, but I can't see clearly. We got to give him credit there, don't we? I mean, he was honest with Jesus. You would do that with your ophthalmologist, wouldn't you? So look, you haven't got it yet. I mean, that's the whole point. It's the only time that it took Jesus, as far as I know in the New Testament, it's the only time Jesus didn't get it on the first try, but he didn't for whatever reason. So he says, "Let me try again." When he tries again, he says, "Now how are your eyes?" And he says, "Now I can see clearly." Clearly. Let me tell you this. I think that's what the relationship with Jesus Christ does for you and me. It helps us to see things clearly. Unfortunately, there may be preachers who will tell you this, but unfortunately it's not true. A relationship with Jesus Christ doesn't mean you're going to be healed immediately. It doesn't mean that you're going to be made wealthy or relieved of whatever issues you're facing at any particular time. But a relationship with Jesus Christ does help you to see clearly. It helps you to see the long view. You see, the problem with you and me is that most of the time we are suffering from myopia, short-sightedness. We see what happened yesterday and we see what is happening today, and that's it. The relationship with Jesus Christ helps us to see clearly by seeing what happened in the beginning, what happened yesterday, what is happening today, what will happen tomorrow, and what will happen in the long view. And that is life-changing. That is what is life-changing about our relationship with Jesus Christ. Over the last few weeks, there was a famous Methodist preacher of another generation who once wrote a book entitled "Stories I've Told Twice." Over the last few weeks, I've been sharing some stories that I've told twice. I'm going to do that now. In 1975, I was sent to Frisco, Texas to be the pastor of the Methodist church there. If you haven't been around very long, you're not going to believe this, but the population of Frisco at the time was 1,800. The little church in Frisco had a membership of 300. I was there for 5 years, 75 to 80. While I was there, most of the people that lived there were old-timers. You know, they'd lived there all their lives, but a few people were starting to move out of Dallas. They wanted the rural lifestyle. And a couple by the name of Bob and Janie Winters moved to Frisco, bought a nice home out on the east side of Frisco. Janie came to church, and she and I became friends. She invited me to their home one day, and I went out and I met her husband, Bob, and that was the first of many visits. Her husband, Bob, and I became close friends as well. But Bob never went to church. He didn't believe in church. I'm not sure he believed in God. But we became good friends. In 1980, the bishop sent me to First Methodist Church in Burke Burnett, a little town north of Wichita Falls. I served there from 1980 to 1983. On June the 7th, 1982, I was driving to work one morning. I had the radio on, and I heard the news. Those of you who were living in Plano at the time will remember this incident. I heard the news about a terrible tragedy that had taken place in Plano, Texas. An armed robber had entered a convenience store at the corner of Parker and Central Expressway, not far from where we are today. He'd walked in. The clerk of the store was there, and another man had come in to buy coffee. He tied them both up, he had them kneel, and he executed them both, mafia style. Walked out with $40. Front page, headlines. About 1 o'clock that day, I received a phone call from Janie. She said, "Don, this is Janie Winters." She said, "Have you heard about what happened in Plano today?" And I said, "Yes, I have." She said, "The man who was killed along with the convenience clerk was Bob." She said everybody knew this. He stopped by there. He was a corporate vice president. He stopped by there to buy his coffee on the way to work every morning. And she said, "Don, you know that Bob wasn't a church person. You're the only minister he knows. Would you be willing to come and do the memorial service for him?" And I told her I would. She said, "By the way, Don, let me warn you that all of Bob's family will be here." They were from the north someplace, Chicago maybe, I'm not sure. She said they will be here, and then they are not church people. And for the most part, they are not believers. I said, "Okay." On the day of Bob's funeral, I drove from Burke Burnett down to Frisco about 2.5 or 3 hours. And in all honesty, I didn't know for sure what I was going to say. I kept wrestling with this issue that the people who would be there to celebrate Bob Winter's life were not Christians. And finally, I settled upon the idea that I would just talk about gratitude. And so when I stood before this family, I said, "Let us give thanks today for the life of Bob Winters." We can figure out what happened or why it happened. We can't make any sense out of that. But what we can do is affirm the good news that Bob was created by God, loved and sustained in this life by God, loved by you and me. And we can give thanks for that good life, regardless of this tragedy. About a week later, I received a letter from a member of his family. They'd gone back north. This is what they wrote. "Dear Reverend Underwood, we want to thank you for the service. In it, you mentioned that we should practice giving thanks for the life of Bob every single day and the knowledge that he has gone home and that he lives with a God who loves him and cares for him every single day. We have been doing precisely that, and we no longer doubt the reality of that faith. Thank you." 1 year later, almost exactly, the bishop appointed me to serve Christ United Methodist Church. At that time, our church was over on a little street called Glencliff. A lot of you are here, you remember it was a little church. It was in a residential area, kind of hidden back in a residential area of Plano. On my third Sunday here in 1983, June the 26th, 1983, my third sermon, I decided to preach a sermon on gratitude. So I talked about Thanksgiving and gratitude in general, and I finished the sermon by telling the story that I just shared with you, the story about Bob Winters, and I read that note. The sermon was well received, about 300 people there that day, I guess. People waited in line to greet me. I was still the new preacher. As they were greeting me, I noticed out of the corner of my eye a young woman in her early 20s hanging around the corner of the Centrum. Some of you remember it was a round room, and she was just kind of hanging around. She caught my attention. After everyone else had left, she came up to me and she said, "Reverend Underwood, have you got just a moment?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I can't really explain why I am here today." She said, I've not been to church in a very, very long time. I've doubted. I've had all sorts of doubts about God. And if God exists at all, I've been angry with God. But she said, this morning when I woke up, I had this feeling that I should go to church today. It was like a voice on the inside of me just kind of nagging me, I need to go to church today. She said, I got up, I got dressed, I got in my automobile. I didn't have a church home, so I didn't even know where to go. And so I started driving up and down the streets of Plano. I drove up and down some major streets in Plano and saw large churches. But for some reason, it just seemed to me that that wasn't the church I was supposed to go to. And then I came over and I started driving through the neighborhoods. And when I drove by this church, that voice spoke to me again, and it just said, this was where I was supposed to attend church today. So I pulled into the parking lot, and I came to church. She started crying at this point. She said, the reason I tell you this is that the young man who was the convenience clerk that was killed along with Bob Winters was my fiance. And she said, I have struggled and struggled and struggled with what happened. And I've struggled with life. She said, now I know that he's with God and that my life will go on. And she just fell into my arms, weeping. I have been haunted by that story for 30 years. Let me ask you this question. Do you think that was luck? Or do you think that was God? I do too. I think it was God. I know it was God. I can't explain it, but I know it was God. And I believe in the power of the proclamation of the church to change lives. I believe in the power of this message of Jesus, the good news of Jesus, that I love you, I created you, I will sustain you, I forgive you, I will redeem your life, I will give you a powerful job that will change your life. I believe in the proclamation of the church. I've given the last 42 years of my life to the church. And I intend to give my remaining years to the church, and I intend to cross the finish line, proclaiming with my dying breath the good news of Jesus Christ. Thanks be to God.